Welcome to Phase 2 of the Introduction to the Appropriation of Lonergan's Methodologies. Day 4, which will be concentrating, or at least introducing, the notion of the core level, the institutional level, the level of the good of order. Last week we dealt with the conditioning level, the standing wave of matter and energy that supports the human activities that we do. They allow us to take something that we can form in our mind and make them a practicality out in the world, in the sense of building a bridge or building an organization, or in this particular case, building an institution. I'd like to point out that at this stage in our investigation of a directed case study, our first cuts are not necessarily all that accurate, or definitely need a lot of modifications. In design work, what happens is you start with something that may be a possible solution, and then you gradually improve it until it reaches a threshold level in which it's acceptable. That solution is never perfect. There's always further development that can go on, but at some point you reach a point that it is actually viable. It's a form that's actually viable, that can be built and constructed and made manifest in human affairs. So this is just a proviso that what is being presented today is only the initial cut of trying to understand this core level of the institutional life of human beings. I'd like to start with a quick introduction to the notion of an institution. An institution is essentially an organization that cannot be allowed to fail. It is so essential to the core meaning of a society, of a culture, of a civilization, that if that organization were to fail, it would take down a lot of the good of order, the institutional structure of that civilization. So an organization is something that cannot be allowed to fail. Organizations themselves are complex, dynamic, and recurring schemes of operations that are designed or orientated to providing a particular service or task. The range is quite large now. In wealth-creating societies, you have financial institutions, educational institutions, religious institutions, all sorts of different institutions that together make up the, I suppose you could say, the good of order, or the spirit of an age. They provide a steady stream of particular goods. So if you're going to a church, the church provides you with a steady stream of transcendental elements that can influence a person's life. Banking, for example, provides a steady stream of financial services to all sorts of people, including other institutions, and that they do on a regular basis, and it's repeatable and it's reoccurring. They provide a steady stream, and they do so because they're organized in such a way as to provide that steady stream. So the organizational structure of an institution is such that it is devoted towards providing that particular type of good that it's seeking to do. So organizations differ according to their target task. Each organization, when it becomes an institution, has a possibility of emergence and also a possibility of survivability. This means that someone would have an idea of an organization, or making an organization into an institution, but it also, and this is simply an idea, it becomes a possibility at that point. But then there are a number of different factors that will allow for the creation, the actual manifestation of that particular idea, that form. And these are quite divergent, they're quite different in many different cases. But they do provide a general probability of the emergence. The other aspect is that once an institution has emerged as a functional organization, very necessary to the good of order of the society, of the civilization, it then has a possibility of survival. Now, survivability is, again, due to a number of factors, but the core of it is largely a failure for people in the institution to handle either an internal or an external problem that has arisen within their framework, within their operational framework. The failure to meet these problems eventually results in a loss of resources, because that failure, if it's a very deep failure, means this organization becomes irrelevant to the world at large, to the greater community, and at that point the institution is no longer supported. It becomes simply another organization that, if it fails, fine; if it doesn't fail, also fine. And then it progresses. Once it becomes an organization, then it's on its last legs, because organizations themselves don't tend to last very long. Take, for example, a business organization. They have a fairly low survival rate if you think of it in terms of, let's say, centuries or a millennium, for example. There's very few banking institutions that are still around after 1,000 years. It varies. There are certain institutions that do. For example, things like the Catholic Church, for example, might be an organization that continues on down through time. But even so, it does so in ways in which it is adapted to the situations that they're in. Failure to do this, for example, was one of the great follies that led to the divisions within the church, to the confessional structure that currently exists, which probably never would have happened if the popes at the time had taken the care to pull together a conference to deal with these issues, rather than entertaining themselves by the different power games that they were involved in. Together, all these institutions form what Lonergan calls the good of order. The order of society allows for a steady stream of these productions of particular goods. And the greater the degree of cohesion, the greater the degree of trust among various members, the reliability among different people, the better, in some sense, the good of order. Now, the good of order is highly conditioned by the lower level of the standing pattern of energy and matter that human beings create and manifest around them all the time. But they do define a spirit of an age. And the spirit of an age, for example, let's say the Renaissance or the Roman period, are fairly distinct in terms of the general pattern, the general appreciative system that was operative at that particular time. But the institutional structures are always in conflict for a number of different reasons. One is there's competing interests. Some organizations or some institutions are devoted to advancing one particular area, let's say environmental protection, while another is dealing with, let's say, promoting technological development. And the two don't necessarily combine very well. The institutions may go their separate ways, they may end up in conflict. There's a whole variety of patterns. The part of this is due to a difference in terminal values. Currently today we find a difference between what you could call a progressive globalist set of values and perhaps a more traditional set of values that, on the other hand. Now your selection of terminal value, if your terminal value deals with wealth, then you're entering into the banking business. If your terminal value is in some sense with the transcendent, then you're into the religious sphere. And there's all sorts of differences there. There are also differences made from egotism, from building an institution simply because a person is capable and does it out of their own purposes. Or it's also an opportunity for group bias to rear its head too as well. When the institution becomes more important than any other institution and people within it focus on developing their own well-being rather than assigning and working at the task to which the institution nominally has some sort of assignment. There's also a matter of a degree of intellectual, moral, and religious conversion, something that we'll get into a bit deeper when we take to the sublating level of the transcendental realm of meaning. But it is still operative in human affairs, simply because people who are intellectually converted, people who take the stance that they are critical realists rather than empiricists, conceptualists, or naive realists, or people that are morally converted in the sense that they are quite willing, or at least capable of, putting their own interests aside in favor of something greater than themselves, let's just say truth or justice. And then there's religious conversion, which in Lonergan's perspective is simply a falling in love with God. The world in which you live is very, very different if the person has fallen in love with God. Things change quite dramatically. And this is also a factor in the institutional life of any particular culture. There's another aspect that is very particular to common sense. These institutions are built by people of common sense. They're people that know how to get things done, that know how things work, that know how to manage and regulate things. And this is very admirable, and it's great, lots of achievements being made. They do, however, come with one particular flaw. Common sense tends to think of itself as being omnipotent, in the sense that there's no theoretical, philosophical, or theological, or any other power or authority greater than themselves, in the sense of getting things done. What this happens is that the motivations behind any particular enterprise become specific to that particular area. So what happens over time is that all these different attempts to make order or to regulate or to solve a particular problem eventually become disconnected from all other efforts, and you end up with a very fragmented good of order. It's one in which there's no intelligibility to it because no intelligence was ever applied to it. It's a case in many ways of fragmentation and reductionism too as well, because in a fragmented society the influence of the transcendental realm of meaning plays far less a role, or can play far less a role, simply because things are so disconnected. You can't have the degree of trust and communications and the personal relationships at the reflective level of the human good. The one thing we need to also keep in mind is that these institutions are very human in the sense that they are built and constructed and maintained by human beings. Now, the thing about one particular fundamental change, institutional change, that has happened in the last several centuries is the application of reason to human affairs. Up until fairly recently, it was the norm that if you had a plan or a policy, you had to have a rational justification for that plan or policy. It could not be done simply by fiat, simply because I say it's that way, or simply because, I'm in power, or this is the way it's going to be, and so forth. This fundamental institutional change, by basing your plans and policies on some sort of rational aspect, is only partially true when it comes to understanding the institutional level. Because operative in human experiences there's actually Lonergan presents 4 of what he calls the patterns of experience in common sense. And these drive people. So people are not only driven by the intellect, it's a part of it. But rationality is only a part of the driving and motivating factors behind human endeavors. For example, one would be drama. Human beings are innately dramatic. We tell stories, we tell narratives. These stories, they become myths. These myths become very powerful because they structure how you can live out your life. You're living out your life according to this narrative, to this myth, to whatever you want to call it. The dramatic aspect also engages at personal levels. One of the odd phenomena in organizations and institutions is that the people at the top develop a very hatred of possible successors. And this is simply a dramatic aspect of it, but it's also connected with the aesthetic, which is the emotional, the feelings of awe, respect, but also fear, anxiety, and so forth. The ability for people to handle the dramatic elements, the aesthetics, the feelings involved in it, and also the level of biological. There's a biological aspect to our human living that's also incredibly powerful. So all these influences are taking place at the institutional level. You have the rationalization, you have the intellect, but you also have the need for dramatic expression. You have the need for the feelings. Feelings in some cases override rationality. If you get a group mob going, feelings certainly are disconnected from any sort of rational consideration. And the biological aspect to it as well, of the continuation of the species and so forth. So people are not only rational. In fact, many of the drivers are very specifically dramatic and also aesthetic in terms of feeling. The biological is probably there, but it's something that our culture does not really understand, the biological aspect of these institutions. There is so we have this fundamental institutional change. One of the interesting aspects of this, of the dramatic and the aesthetic and so forth, is public shaming. People do a lot of things quietly in the background that run against the norms of their society. The problem is that they do run against the norms of society. There's irregularities, various other things like that people know. But the thing is, as long as they don't become public, these activities can and will continue. The interesting aspect of it is that once these behavior become public and become under the public scrutiny, then the norms start to be applied. And in that case, there's kind of a public shaming that can take place that can actually basically reduce the people involved in this untypical type of behavior very censored. It is also interesting is that it is in this area of the non-public quietly going behind the scenes where evil can flourish. Now, evil is something that we will consider later on when we consider the transcendental realm of meaning, because evil, in the sense that we're going to be using here, refers to sin, and sin goes against your fundamental being of who you are as a human being. It's very different from, let's say, guilt, which is going against the norms of your society. You may fail to perform a duty in the way that society would prefer, or you may do something that society just doesn't like or appreciate, and you go against the norms. And you can feel guilty because you're going against the societal norms. But this is very different from the mystery of sin. And again, we'll get into that when we deal with the transcendental sublating effect on the core institutional level. Finally, I'd like to leave you with the idea that each situation is unique. There may be certain similarities, but when you're talking about understanding a particular institutional structure, you're not talking about understanding an ideal structure of some sort. You're talking about a very specific, very, very unique set of circumstances at one particular place in time and one particular place in space too as well. Because any institution exists part of a history. They have a history, they have a past, they have the pivot points, they anticipate where they're going to be going into the future, whether they're trying to improve value or to avoid value loss, which is another major consideration. But there's also geographical influences too as well. An organization or an institution that, for example, is based in China has, because of the geography is fairly largely flat with a couple of major rivers, communication is quite easily maintained across large areas. So China developed an empire that consisted for a couple of millennium, although the participants changed. And they did so because of the geography of their situation that allowed for this easy transportation. The situation was quite different in Europe, where the mountains and very deep rivers provided barriers to any possible expansion or contact with other groups. So there the institutions tend to be far more localized. You had the breakdown into smaller nationalities. You had, let's say in the medieval period, the charter cities that had control over their own internal affairs. But anyway, the point is that each situation has its own geographical impacts or influences. It also has its own history that it is a part of. It does not stand outside of either the history or the geography of its time and place. This brings us to something that we will be getting into more detail once we've covered the broad structure of these three levels of the standing wave of matter and energy, the core level of institutions, and the sublating level of the transcendental realm of meaning. And that is the need for understanding the orientation of these different institutions, of finding out, of evaluating them, of saying, yeah, these are problems, these are not problems. And the evaluation in a situation in which you have a number of different appreciative systems, a number of different value systems can be very tricky. Because according to one way of thinking, something could not be a problem, whereas to another it obviously is a problem. It's one of the fundamental factors in long-term decline. The evaluation is the kind of one of the things that we'll be doing. Then there's also the diagnosis. Now it's a medical term, but it has a general, broader application too as well. You may say that yes, the existing world order is flawed. It has these, and these problems. All right. But it's another thing to say what is the root cause, the underlying factors, the underlying dynamic operations that are leading to these results. Because when you evaluate a situation, you're only looking at the results of the internal operations of the recurring schemes of operations. You're not looking at the flaws within the recurring schemes themselves. So this is something that, again, we will get to in our laying the foundations for understanding news, fake news. The other factor that is not quite as important for us, but is the next logical step for this, is estimating what can and can't be done in these particular situations. This is important simply because it allows us to get a sense of what could develop, perhaps what should develop, but it gives a different way of understanding the situation that you're in by being able to explore other different operations if some of the internal structure problems were somehow dealt with, eliminated, or converted into something else. So this allows us to explore different options. You have the prognosis, which is what's going to happen if you don't have any changes, and then you have different, I suppose you could say, remedies, possible solutions to these problems, each of which provides a different opportunity to explore different options for human futures. So I'd like to just end, this is day 4. This is our introduction to the core level of institutions. We've dealt with the notion of an institution, with the how they form a good of order or the spirit of an age as a collective, how they are the result of human endeavors, and human endeavors are not always rational, they're also dramatic, aesthetic, and biological impacts too as well. And the notion that there is evil present without getting into the notion of evil yet, and it operates by hiding behind the scenes. That it is very different once these operations or schemes or plans or policies these people are carrying out are brought into the light of day. Then a lot of news can be considered as the public exposure of these little covert operations that are hiding behind the scenes as people go to work towards enhancing their own interests or the interests of the people to whom they have given their allegiance to. And then finally, it's just the idea that each situation is unique. Historical comparisons may help you to understand some aspect of the situation, but it is not the same situation. The situation that we're in now is unique. It has its own history, it has its own dynamics, it has its own geographical elements to it as well, especially when you're dealing with the global level. Because one of the interesting things about our current transportation systems, for example, is that a lot of them are based on oceans. There are some air travel, but largely a lot of the containers, a lot of the material flow of things are done by ships. And this is part of the standing wave aspect of conditions in our society. It is part of the geographical influence at work in human affairs. So I'd like to end day 4 with simply the reminder is that this is an exploratory effort. This is our initial starting point. Like any task of interpretation, you don't start with a blank mind, you start from where you are and then you work out ways to improve or to better understand what is actually out there. But it always starts with what your own position is at the very beginning. So this is our starting point, and over the next few weeks, or next few months, we will continue developing in this until eventually things will relax and you will have a coherent insight that combines both the standing wave conditioning level, the core level of the institution, the effects of the transcendental realm sublating human affairs, and contain this in one consistent, intelligible insight. So thank you. This is Russell Baker signing off for day 4.